The carriage wheel cracked against a stone in the road, and Eleanor Hartley was thrown forward so hard her forehead nearly struck the seat in front of her. The horses screamed. The driver shouted something she could not make out over the wind and the rain, and then the whole carriage tipped sideways into the ditch with a groan of wood and iron that sounded like the world itself breaking apart. For a moment she lay still, breathing hard, waiting to see if she was hurt. Her arm ached where it had struck the door. Her bonnet had come loose and hung by its ribbon around her throat. Rain poured through the open window above her, soaking her sleeve, and somewhere outside a horse was still crying out in pain. She pushed the door open above her head and climbed out into the storm. The driver was already on the ground, kneeling beside one of the horses, whose leg was bent at a wrong angle. He looked up at her with a face gone pale. "We cannot go on tonight, miss," he said. "Not with the horse like this, and not in this weather." Eleanor looked down the dark road, then back the way they had come. Neither direction offered anything she could see through the rain. She was a governess without a post, traveling to a household she had never seen, in a county she did not know, and now she was standing in a ditch in the middle of a storm with a lame horse and a broken wheel. "There is a house," the driver said, pointing through the trees. "Up that drive. Big place. They will have to take us in, storm like this." She did not ask whose house it was. She simply nodded and began walking, her boots sinking into the mud with every step, her trunk left behind for the moment because she could not carry it and keep her footing at the same time. The wind pulled at her skirts. Lightning cracked somewhere behind the hills, and for one long second the whole drive was lit up white, and she saw the house at the end of it. It was enormous. Stone towers rose up against the black sky, and not a single window showed a light except one, high up, burning like a single eye that refused to blink. By the time she reached the great door, she was soaked through and shaking with cold. She lifted the heavy iron knocker and let it fall 3 times before a servant opened the door, an older man with a stern face who looked at her as though she had arrived from the moon. "I am sorry to disturb you," she said, her teeth beginning to chatter. "Our carriage has broken a wheel on the road below, and one of the horses is hurt. I would not ask, but there is nowhere else to go in this storm." The servant hesitated only a moment before stepping back to let her in. "Come in out of the wet," he said. "I will send men for your driver and the horses." The entrance hall was vast and cold, lit by only a few candles, and her wet boots left dark marks on the stone floor. She stood there dripping, trying to make herself smaller, trying not to think of how she must look, when a door at the far end of the hall opened, and a man stepped through it. He was tall, and he moved like someone who was used to rooms going quiet when he entered them. His coat was dark, his face was unsmiling, and his eyes, when they found her, held no warmth at all. He looked at the puddle forming beneath her feet, then at her face, and something in his expression made it very clear that he did not like surprises, and he did not like strangers, and he especially did not like both arriving at his door in the middle of a storm. "Who is this?" he said, not to her, but to the servant beside her, as though she were a piece of furniture that had been delivered without his permission. "A traveler, your grace," the servant said. Her carriage broke down on the road. She asked for shelter. The man's gaze moved back to Eleanor, and she felt it the way one feels a cold draft, sharp and unwelcome. She lifted her chin anyway. She was too tired, too wet, and too irritated to feel small in front of a stranger, duke or not. "I did not ask to be here either," she said. "I assure you I would rather be dry and asleep than standing in your hall dripping on your floor. But the storm did not consult either of us before it broke my wheel." For a moment the hall was utterly silent. The servant's eyes went wide, as though she had said something dangerous. The tall man simply stared at her, his jaw tight, and she wondered for a moment if she had just made the worst mistake of a very bad night. Then he turned to the servant. "See that she is given a room and dry clothes," he said, "and send word to the stables about the horse." He turned and walked away without another word, his boots echoing on the stone, and Eleanor stood there in the cold hall, shivering, and thought that she had never in her life met a man so entirely without warmth. It was only later, wrapped in a borrowed robe in front of a small fire in a guest room, that the housekeeper, a round, kind-faced woman named Mrs. Pruitt, told her where she was. "This is Ashbourne Hall," she said, pouring hot tea into a cup and pressing it into Eleanor's hands. "And that was his grace, the Duke of Ashbourne." Eleanor wrapped her cold fingers around the cup. "I am sorry," she said. "I did not mean to speak to him as I did. I was tired, and I forgot myself." Mrs. Pruitt gave a small, strange smile. "Don't trouble yourself over it, miss. Nobody speaks to him plainly anymore, not in years. They're all too afraid." "Afraid of what?" Mrs. Pruitt glanced at the door, then lowered her voice. as though the walls themselves might carry the words back to him. "He was not always like this," she said. "There was a time this house was full of noise, full of laughing. He had a way of making a room feel alive just by being in it, but that was before." "Before what?" The housekeeper's face closed like a door. "That is not my story to tell, miss. All I will say is that something happened, some years back, and the man who came back from it is not the man who left. He has not laughed, not once, not that I have heard, in longer than I can count. The whole house has learned to walk quiet around him, like he might break if we make a sound." Eleanor said nothing, but she thought about the way he had looked at her in the hall, cold and closed, like a door bolted from the inside. She thought it was a sad thing, for a man to live inside a house that big and be entirely alone in it. In the morning, the storm had passed, and the world outside her window was washed clean and bright. She dressed in her own clothes, now dry, and made her way down to find out what had become of her carriage, and whether she was expected to leave that very day. She found the Duke in the breakfast room, alone, reading a letter with a face like carved stone. He did not look up when she entered. "Your Grace," she said, "I wanted to thank you for the shelter last night. I will be on my way as soon as the wheel is repaired, and I am sorry for the trouble I caused." He set the letter down and looked at her properly for the first time in daylight. She saw now that he was younger than she had thought the night before, though something in his face made him seem older, worn down in a way that had nothing to do with years. "You are the new governess," he said. It was not a question. Eleanor blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The letter from the agency arrived 3 days ago," he said. "A Miss Hartley, engaged to tutor my sister. I did not expect you to arrive in the middle of a storm, half drowned, in a ditch outside my own gates." She stared at him, understanding slowly dawning, and felt her face go warm with embarrassment. "I did not know this was Ashbourne Hall until Mrs. Pruitt told me," she said. "I thought I was simply a stranger you had taken pity on." Something flickered across his face, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. "I do not take pity on anyone, Miss Hartley," he said. "I took you in because it would have been barbaric to leave a woman in a ditch during a storm. That is not the same thing." "No," she said. "I suppose it is not." He studied her for a long moment, and she had the strange feeling that he was trying to decide something about her, weighing her the way one weighs a stranger who has arrived uninvited and said too much and now must be lived with. "My sister is 12 years old, he said finally. "Her name is Sophie. She has had 3 governesses in 2 years, and none of them lasted more than a season. I will tell you plainly, Miss Hartley, that I do not expect you to last much longer than the others." Eleanor lifted her chin, the same way she had the night before, tired and wet and unwilling to be spoken down to. "Then I suppose we shall see," she said, and turned to find her breakfast, leaving him standing there with an expression she did not stay to read. After breakfast, Mrs. Pruitt led her up 2 flights of stairs to a bright schoolroom at the end of a long corridor. A girl sat at the window seat with her knees pulled up to her chest, a book open and ignored in her lap, staring out at the gardens with the particular stillness of a child who has learned not to expect much from new arrivals. "This is Miss Sophie," Mrs. Pruitt said gently. "Sophie, this is Miss Hartley. She has come to teach you." The girl did not turn around. "You will not stay," she said. "None of them stay." Eleanor crossed the room and sat down on the window seat across from her, close enough to speak quietly, far enough not to crowd her. "I have not decided yet whether I am staying," she said honestly. "I only arrived last night, in the middle of a storm, in a ditch, with a horse that would not stop screaming, and a wheel that had given up entirely. I have not had time to decide anything." That earned her the smallest flicker of attention. "A ditch?" "A very muddy ditch," Eleanor said. "I looked like I had been dragged there by wolves. Your brother found me dripping all over his front hall, and looked at me as though I had personally arranged the storm to inconvenience him." Sophie's mouth twitched, almost a smile, quickly hidden, as though smiling were a thing she had been taught not to do too openly. "He does look at people like that," she admitted. "He looks at everyone like that now." "Now," Eleanor repeated softly. "Has it not always been so?" Sophie's gaze slid back to the window, and the shutters came down again, quick and practiced. "I do not remember," she said, and picked her book back up, and Eleanor understood that the conversation, for today, had ended, and that whatever had closed this house up so tightly had closed the girl up along with it. She did not know, as she walked away, that the Duke of Ashbourne remained in that room for a full minute after she had gone, staring at the door she had walked through, feeling something strange and unfamiliar stir in his chest, something he could not immediately name, because it had been so long since he had felt it that he had almost forgotten what it was called. It was surprise, and beneath the surprise, so faint he almost missed it, was something that felt dangerously close to interest. The goat came out of nowhere. One moment Eleanor was walking Sophie across the east lawn toward the old orangery, discussing the proper way to conjugate a French verb, and the next moment there was a streak of brown and white fur charging straight at them, bleeding with a fury that seemed entirely out of proportion to its size, and behind it ran 2 footmen, red-faced and shouting, and behind them ran a third man carrying a bucket that was clearly meant to contain the animal and clearly failing at its purpose. Sophie screamed, more from surprise than fear, and grabbed Eleanor's arm. The goat veered sideways at the last moment, missed them by a hand's width, and crashed straight through a row of Mrs. Pruitt's drying linens, which had been strung between 2 trees to dry in the morning sun. White sheets came down over the goat's head. The animal, now blind and even more furious, began running in circles, dragging the line and half the laundry with it, while the footmen chased it in widening loops across the lawn, shouting instructions at each other that contradicted one another entirely. Eleanor stood frozen for 1 second, and then she began to laugh. She could not help it. It came up out of her before she had any chance to stop it, and once it started she could not make it stop, watching a ghost made of bedsheets stagger drunkenly across the lawn, while 3 grown men chased it in a wide, useless circle. Sophie beside her had gone from screaming to laughing so hard she had to sit down on the grass, tears streaming down her face, gasping out words that made no sense. "The sheet," she managed. "The sheet has legs." It was at that exact moment that the Duke of Ashbourne came around the corner of the house, drawn by the noise, and stopped dead at the sight before him. His sister sitting on the lawn howling with laughter. The new governess bent double, one hand pressed to her side. A ghost draped in linen careening across his gardens with 3 of his staff in pursuit. For one long moment he simply stood there, and Eleanor, wiping her eyes, caught sight of his face and saw something happen to it that she had not seen before. His mouth twitched. Just at the corner, a small, involuntary movement quickly suppressed, as though his own face had betrayed him and he was working hard to arrest the betrayal before it went any further. He pressed his lips together. He looked away from the goat, toward the house, toward anything that was not the ridiculous scene unfolding on his lawn, and Eleanor watched him fight it, watched the muscles in his jaw working, and understood with a small shock that the Duke of Ashbourne was trying very hard not to laugh. He lost. It came out of him low and rough, almost a bark, as though the sound itself had grown rusty from disuse, and he seemed as startled by it as anyone. He cut it off almost immediately, clearing his throat, straightening his coat, but it was too late. Sophie had heard it. She stopped laughing entirely and stared at her brother with wide eyes, as though he had performed a magic trick. "You laughed," she said. "I did no such thing," he said, and there was something almost desperate in how quickly he said it. "You did," Sophie insisted. "I heard you." The Duke's expression closed like a shutter dropping over a window. "It was a cough," he said. "Someone see to that animal before it destroys the entire garden." He turned and walked back around the house without another word, his stride longer and faster than it needed to be, and Eleanor watched him go, and found that she was smiling in a way that had nothing to do with the goat at all. That evening, at dinner, he did not mention it, and neither did she, though she caught him once, halfway through the soup course, looking at her with an expression she could not quite name, somewhere between suspicion and curiosity, as though she were a puzzle he had not decided whether to solve. "Miss Hartley," he said finally, breaking a silence that had stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, "my sister tells me you spent an hour after the incident this morning teaching her the proper names for types of clouds. She was upset by the noise," Eleanor said. "I find that children calm faster when their minds are given something new to hold on to. Clouds seemed a safe distance from goats. And did it work?" She named 4 different formations before supper, Eleanor said. "I believe she has decided that cumulus clouds look like sheep, which under the circumstances felt like an unfortunate connection to make, but she was very pleased with herself, so I did not correct her." Something moved behind his eyes again, that same flicker from the lawn, quickly hidden. Sophie, watching her brother rather than her plate, said nothing, but Eleanor noticed that the girl's shoulders had lost some of their usual stiffness, that she sat a little looser in her chair than she had at breakfast the day before. Over the following 2 weeks, small things began to shift in the house, quietly, the way ice begins to thin before anyone notices the water beneath it. Eleanor found that the Duke, despite his reputation, was not a cruel man, only a guarded one. He answered her questions about the estate directly and without condescension. He listened when she made suggestions about Sophie's lessons, even when those suggestions ran against how the previous governesses had done things. He did not speak much, but when he did speak, it was honest, and Eleanor had begun to prefer his honesty to the easy flattery she had grown used to hearing from men in other households. She also learned, through small comments dropped by Mrs. Pruitt and the other staff, fragments of a story no one would tell her whole. Something about a woman, something about a wedding that never happened, something about the year the house had gone quiet and stayed that way. No one would give her more than fragments, and she did not press, because she could see, whenever the subject came near him, how quickly his face shuttered closed, how his shoulders squared as though bracing for a blow. A few days after the incident with the goat, rain kept everyone indoors for the better part of 2 days, and Eleanor found Sophie curled into a window seat in the library, staring out at the gray gardens with a restlessness that no amount of embroidery or arithmetic seemed able to cure. Eleanor set aside the lesson book entirely, and asked instead if Sophie would like to hear a story, one she made up on the spot, about a girl who could speak to clouds and convince them to rain only where she wished. Sophie's interest sharpened immediately, and for the better part of an hour, Eleanor spun an increasingly ridiculous tale, adding details as she went. A cloud with a terrible sense of direction, a thunderstorm that only wanted to be liked, until Sophie was laughing so freely that neither of them noticed the study door had opened until they heard it click shut again. Eleanor turned in time to see the Duke's retreating shoulders through the glass panel of the door, and she wondered how long he had been standing there, and how much he had heard, and whether the sound of his sister laughing so easily had been a comfort to him or a quiet kind of pain. She did not ask Sophie whether she had noticed her brother in the doorway. Some things, she thought, were better left where they had fallen. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor made her way down to the library herself, thinking to find something to read until her mind grew tired enough to rest. She did not expect to find the Duke already there, a single candle burning beside him, a book open on his knee that he did not appear to be reading. "Forgive me," she said, already backing toward the door. "I did not know the room was occupied." "Stay," he said, and the word surprised them both. "If you like. I am poor company tonight, but the room is large enough for 2 people who do not wish to speak to each other." She hesitated, then crossed to the shelves nearest the fire and selected a volume of poetry more or less at random, and settled into the chair across from his, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all. The fire cracked softly, rain tapped against the windows. It was, Eleanor thought, one of the more comfortable silences she had shared with anyone in a very long time, the kind that did not need filling, the kind 2 people could sit inside without either of them feeling the pressure to perform conversation they did not want to have. "Sophie tells me you invented an entire kingdom of clouds this afternoon," he said eventually, not looking up from his book. "She required distraction from the weather," Eleanor said. "I found the weather itself made a convenient subject." "You have a talent for it," he said. "Distraction, making difficult things feel lighter than they are." "It is not a difficult talent to learn," she said, "when one has needed it for oneself as often as I have." He looked up at that, something curious in his expression, as though she had handed him a thread he wanted to pull but did not yet feel he had earned the right to tug. He did not ask what she meant by it, and she did not offer more, and the silence that followed was different from the one before, charged now with things unsaid on both sides, but not unpleasant for it. One afternoon, walking back from the stables where she had gone to check on the horse that had been injured the night of the storm, now healed and returned to its stall, she found the Duke standing alone near the paddock fence, watching nothing in particular, lost somewhere far from the present moment. "Your Grace," she said, and he startled slightly, as though she had pulled him back from somewhere distant. "Miss Hartley," he said, recovering his composure quickly, too quickly, the way a man recovers who has had a great deal of practice hiding what he actually feels. "I did not mean to intrude," she said. "You are not intruding," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I was only thinking." She should have left it there. She knew, even as she spoke, that she was pressing somewhere she had not been invited to press, but there was something in the stillness of him, in the way he held himself like a man carrying something heavy that he had carried for so long he had forgotten it could be set down, that made her ask anyway. "May I ask you something?" she said, and he did not answer, which she took as permission, or at least as the absence of refusal. "Were you always like this? So careful, so closed off from everything?" For a long moment he said nothing at all, and she thought she had finally gone too far, that he would turn and walk away, and she would spend the rest of her time at Ashbourne Hall being coldly, correctly ignored. But he did not walk away. He kept his eyes on the horizon, on the hills turning gold in the late afternoon light, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "No," he said. "I was not always like this." He did not say anything more, and she did not ask him to, and they stood together at the fence in silence, watching the horses move slowly across the paddock, and something passed between them in that silence that neither of them had words for yet, something small and fragile, and entirely unfamiliar to a house that had spent years learning how to stay quiet. It was Sophie who broke the moment, calling from somewhere near the stable door, asking if she might be allowed to name the horse that had recovered from its injury on the night of the storm. The Duke turned toward his sister's voice, and Eleanor watched the careful mask settle back over his face, though it did not fit quite as tightly as it had before, as though something in it had loosened just slightly and had not yet found its way back into place. "You may name him whatever you like," he called back, "so long as it is not something absurd." Sophie considered this with great seriousness. "I shall call him Thunder," she announced, "since he arrived in a storm." "That is not absurd at all," the Duke said, and Eleanor thought she heard, beneath the flat and careful tone he used, something almost like warmth trying to find its way back to the surface. As they walked back toward the house together, Sophie skipping ahead of them chattering about all the things Thunder might learn to do, Eleanor glanced sideways at the Duke and found him watching his sister with an expression she had not seen on him before, something unguarded, something that looked almost like hope, quickly hidden the moment he noticed her watching. "She kept a governess before you," he said quietly, so that Sophie would not hear. "A woman named Miss Prentice. Sophie did not speak for nearly a month after she left. I did not think another governess would manage to undo that kind of silence so quickly." "I have not undone anything," Eleanor said. "Children find their own way back to laughter, given the smallest opening. I have only tried not to stand in the way of it." He was quiet for a moment, considering this, his eyes still on his sister's small figure moving ahead of them across the darkening lawn. "Perhaps," he said finally, "that is a rarer gift than you believe it to be, Miss Hartley." She did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, and they walked the rest of the way back to the house in a silence that had, without either of them quite noticing when it happened, stopped feeling like distance and started feeling like something closer to companionship. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by the time Eleanor found the Duke that evening, he had already burned it. She noticed the ash first, a curl of blackened paper caught at the edge of the study fireplace, and then she noticed him, standing very still at the window with his back to the room, his hands clasped behind him so tightly that the knuckles had gone pale. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I did not mean to disturb you. Mrs. Pruitt said you wished to see me about Sophie's lessons." "It can wait," he said without turning around. She should have left then. Every instinct told her to leave then, to close the door quietly and let him have whatever grief or anger the letter had brought him, alone, the way he clearly wished to have it. But something about the rigid line of his shoulders, the particular stillness of a man holding himself together by force rather than by ease, made her stay instead. "I will go, if you wish it," she said, "but I do not think you wish to be alone right now, whatever you have told yourself about it." He turned to face her then, and she was startled by what she saw in his expression, not the cold reserve she had grown used to, but something rawer, something that looked like an old wound that had been reopened without warning. "It is nothing that concerns you," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction to make the words sound true. She did not press. She simply crossed the room and sat down in the chair nearest the fire, the same chair she had taken the night of the rainstorm, and picked up the book she had left there 2 evenings before, and began to read, or pretended to, giving him the choice of whether to speak or not without the pressure of her waiting for it. For a long while he said nothing. The fire popped and settled. Rain had begun again outside, soft against the windows, and somewhere in the house a clock struck the hour and then fell silent. She had nearly convinced herself he would say nothing at all, that she had misjudged the moment and ought to have left when she had the chance, when his voice finally broke the quiet, low and rough, as though the words had to be forced up from somewhere he had buried them a long time ago. "Her name was Isabel," he said. Eleanor set down her book without looking up too quickly, without doing anything that might startle the words back into silence. "We were to be married 5 years ago," he continued. "Everything was arranged. The church, the guests, my mother's dress remade for the occasion. I had known her since we were children. I believed, in the particular foolish way a young man believes such things, that I understood exactly what my life was going to look like for the next 50 years, and that the understanding was a comfort rather than a trap." He paused, and Eleanor waited, saying nothing, letting the silence hold the space he needed to fill it in his own time. 3 days before the wedding, he said, she was thrown from her horse during a ride she had taken alone, against everyone's advice, because she said she needed air and could not bear to be watched every moment before the ceremony. They found her 2 hours later. She never woke again. Eleanor felt the words land in her chest like something physical, a weight settling where breath should have been. "I am so sorry," she said quietly, and meant it entirely, though she understood, even as she said it, that no words offered 5 years late could undo what he was carrying. "Everyone was very sorry," he said, and there was an edge in his voice now, something bitter and old. "Everyone told me how sorry they were, and then, within a season, they began telling me it was time to move forward, time to find another match, as though grief had a schedule that decent people were expected to keep. My own mother suggested, not 6 months after the funeral, that I ought to consider Lady Camilla Sinclair, because the families had always got on well and it would be practical." "And did you?" Eleanor asked. His laugh was short and without any humor in it at all. "I stopped attending balls. I stopped attending anything that required me to stand in a room and be looked at with pity, or worse, with calculation, as though my grief were an inconvenience ending between some ambitious family and a very good match. I came here, to Ashbourne, and I found that if I did not speak, if I did not laugh, if I gave the world nothing to comment on, it eventually stopped commenting altogether and simply left me be." "And has it?" she asked softly. "Left you be." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, and when he answered, his voice had lost its edge entirely, gone thin and honest in a way she suspected he rarely allowed anyone to hear. "No," he said. "It has not. It has only stopped saying so out loud. Every letter that arrives from a certain corner of my family is still, in one way or another, asking when I intend to stop mourning and start behaving usefully again. Tonight's letter was no different." She thought of Lady Camilla's name, filed it away without comment, and found herself more curious than she had any right to be about a woman she had never met, who had been offered to this grieving man like a solution to a problem he had never asked to have solved. "I do not think grief works on anyone's schedule but its own," she said. "I think people who tell you otherwise have simply never carried anything heavy enough to understand how long it takes to learn how to walk while holding it." He looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way that made her aware of how close their chairs sat to one another, how the firelight moved across his face and softened, for just a moment, the hardness that had settled there over 5 long years. "You speak as though you know something about it," he said, carrying something heavy. She considered how much to tell him, weighing the fairness of asking a man to open an old wound while keeping her own carefully closed. "My father died when I was 17, she said finally. "My mother did not survive him by more than 2 years, though the physicians never could agree on what illness took her. I have supported myself since I was 19, moving from household to household, watching other people's children grow up in homes I was never quite a part of. It is not the same as what you have lost, but I understand something of what it is to keep walking when the ground beneath you has changed entirely without your permission." He was silent for a long moment, and something in his face shifted, some wall she had not fully realized was there, settling half an inch lower than it had been before. "I did not know that," he said. "There was no reason you should," she said. "It is not the sort of thing one announces over breakfast." He almost smiled at that, the corner of his mouth lifting briefly before he caught it and pulled it back into its usual careful line, but she saw it, and she thought it was, in its own small way, more honest than the laugh she had heard on the lawn weeks before, because it had come from something painful they had both just shared, rather than something ridiculous they had both just witnessed. They sat together for a while longer, not speaking of Isabel again, not speaking of Lady Camilla or the letter or the family that seemed determined to move him past a grief he had not finished carrying, but simply sitting in the quiet of the fire in the rain, two people who had each, in their own way, learned to survive being left behind by the people they had trusted to stay. When she finally rose to return to her room, he stood as well, an old habit of courtesy that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her, given how rarely he seemed to extend such gestures to anyone in the house. "Thank you," he said, and it was clear from his tone that the words cost him something, that gratitude did not come easily to a man who had spent 5 years believing that letting people close only gave them one more way to leave him. "You do not need to thank me," she said. "I only sat in a chair and read a book badly while you spoke." "You stayed," he said. "That is not nothing, Miss Hartley. Most people, given the choice, do not." She did not have an answer for that, so she simply inclined her head and left him there by the fire, and as she climbed the stairs to her room, she found she was thinking not of Isabel, or of the letter, or even of the strange, aching kindness of the story he had trusted her with, but of the small, broken half-smile that had crossed his face for one unguarded second, and of how badly she wanted to see it again, fully formed, without the ghost of grief pulling it back down before it could finish becoming what it wanted to be. She did not yet understand what that wanting meant. She only knew that something in the house had shifted that evening, quietly, the way a lock turns after years of rust, stiff and reluctant but not, in the end, impossible to move. That night, long after she had returned to her own room, Eleanor lay awake staring at the ceiling, turning the evening over in her mind the way one turns over a stone to see what lives beneath it. She thought of Isabel, a woman she had never met and never would, whose absence still shaped every guarded look the Duke gave the world. She thought of the letter burned in the grate, of a family that measured grief in seasons and expected it to conclude on schedule, and of how strange it was that a man so thoroughly walled in by loss had still chosen, of all the people in his household, to hand her a piece of the truth he kept from everyone else. She told herself it meant nothing beyond simple trust, the kind that grows naturally between two people living under the same roof, sharing meals and small daily troubles. But some quieter, more honest part of her recognized that she had wanted him to keep talking long after the fire had burned low, that she had noticed the particular way his voice changed when he spoke of Isabel, softer and rawer than his usual measured tone, and that she had spent the walk back to her room replaying the half-smile he had given her rather than the grief that came before it. It was, she decided, an unwise thing to notice, in a house where she was employed to teach a child her letters and nothing more, where the distance between a duke and a governess was as fixed and immovable as the stone walls around them. She resolved, as she finally drifted toward sleep, to keep her thoughts more carefully in order going forward, a resolution that lasted, as it happened, less than a full day. The following morning brought an unwelcome surprise in the form of a carriage bearing a crest Eleanor did not recognize, and within the hour the entire household knew that Lady Camilla Sinclair had arrived at Ashbourne Hall, uninvited, accompanied by her mother, and a great quantity of luggage that suggested she intended to stay for considerably longer than a single afternoon. Eleanor met her only briefly, in the hallway outside the drawing room, where Lady Camilla stood examining a portrait of the late Duke and Duchess with the particular attentiveness of a woman calculating how such things might one day belong to her. She was beautiful in an exact, practiced way, her hair arranged without a single strand out of place, her gown cut in the latest fashion, and when her eyes landed on Eleanor, they moved over her plain gray dress and unremarkable bonnet with a swiftness that made it clear exactly how little Eleanor mattered in whatever calculations Lady Camilla was making that day. "You must be the governess," Lady Camilla said, in a tone that made the words sound like something slightly distasteful. "I understand my dear Julian's sister has taken quite a liking to you." Eleanor inclined her head politely, refusing to be baited into either agreement or apology for the fact of existing. "Sophie is a delightful pupil," she said. "I am fortunate in my post." Lady Camilla's smile did not reach her eyes. "How fortunate for you both," she said, and swept past her into the drawing room without another word, leaving behind the distinct impression that she considered the matter of Eleanor's presence at Ashbourne Hall to be a temporary and entirely unimportant inconvenience, one she expected to be resolved as soon as she herself had settled into her proper place in the household. Eleanor spent the rest of the day keeping carefully to the schoolroom, teaching Sophie her lessons and trying not to think too much about the sound of Lady Camilla's laughter drifting up occasionally from the drawing room below, bright and practiced, nothing at all like the rare, rusted sound she had heard from the Duke on the lawn weeks before. At dinner that evening, she watched him across the table, his face arranged back into the careful, closed expression she had first met in the storm, giving nothing away to Lady Camilla's determined attempts at conversation, answering her questions with the same brief courtesy he might extend to any acquaintance. No more and no less. Eleanor told herself it was not her place to feel the small, sharp discomfort that rose in her chest each time Lady Camilla touched his sleeve to make a point, or leaned toward him to laugh at something only she seemed to find amusing, and she told herself this several times over the course of the meal, with limited success. Sophie, seated beside her, ate in near silence, her earlier brightness dimmed considerably by the presence of a guest she plainly did not care for, and once, when Lady Camilla made an offhand comment about how children were so much easier to admire from a comfortable distance, Eleanor saw the girl's shoulders draw inward, retreating back into the careful stillness she had worn the day Eleanor first arrived. Later that night, after Sophie had been put to bed and the house had gone quiet, Eleanor found herself walking the upper corridor rather than settling to sleep, her mind too full of the day's events to rest. She came upon the Duke standing outside his sister's door, listening, she realized, to make certain the girl had settled peacefully, an act of quiet care that Lady Camilla would never have witnessed and would not have understood if she had. "She does not care for Lady Camilla," Eleanor said quietly, before she could stop herself. "Neither," he said, "do I." The honesty of it surprised her, given how carefully he had guarded himself all evening at the table. "Then why does she remain here?" she asked, so that only he could hear it. "Because my mother arranged the visit before I had any say in the matter," he said, "and because turning a guest out of Ashbourne Hall without cause would create precisely the kind of talk I have spent 5 years trying to avoid. She will stay a fortnight, as courtesy requires, and then she will leave, and nothing will have changed by it, whatever she or my mother might hope." Eleanor said nothing, though something in her chest had eased slightly at the certainty in his voice, and she was aware, uncomfortably aware, of how much that ease mattered to her, and how little right she had to feel it at all. "Good night, Miss Hartley," he said, and there was something gentler in the way he said her name than there had been the first morning he had said it across the breakfast table, weeks ago now, when she had still been a stranger dripping on his floor. "Good night, Your Grace," she answered, and made herself walk on to her own room without looking back, though she was entirely aware, the whole length of the corridor, of him standing there still, watching her go. The scream came from the kitchen garden, high and panicked, and Eleanor was running before she had fully registered whose voice it was. She found Sophie standing frozen at the edge of the pond, staring down at something in the water, her whole body rigid with a fear so complete she could not seem to make a single sound beyond the scream that had already left her. It took Eleanor a moment to see what she was looking at, a small brown dog, the kitchen boy's terrier, thrashing weakly in the water near the center of the pond, too far for Sophie to reach, too exhausted already to pull itself back to the bank. Eleanor did not think. She kicked off her shoes and waded in, the cold closing around her legs and then her waist as the ground dropped away faster than she expected, and she pushed forward through water that dragged at her skirts like hands trying to hold her back, until she reached the dog and got both arms around its shaking body, and turned back toward the bank. By the time she reached shallow water again, the Duke was there, having come at a dead run from somewhere across the grounds, and he waded in without hesitation to take the dog from her arms and then, when her own feet slipped on the muddy bottom, to catch her by the arm and haul her the rest of the way onto dry ground. She sat there on the grass, soaked through for the second time since arriving at Ashbourne Hall, shaking with cold and with the sudden release of fear, while the Duke set the shivering dog down beside her and crouched in front of her, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes moving over her face with an intensity that made her breath catch for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. "Are you hurt?" he said, his voice rougher than she had ever heard it. "Eleanor, are you hurt?" It was the first time he had used her given name, and she noticed it even through the chattering of her own teeth, even through the general chaos of the moment, the way one notices a single bright thread pulled loose from an otherwise ordinary piece of cloth. "I am well," she managed, cold, but well. Sophie arrived then, dropping to her knees beside the dog and gathering it into her lap, sobbing with relief now that the danger had passed, and around them the household staff who had heard the commotion began arriving in a flurry of blankets and worried questions, and the moment between Eleanor and the Duke closed as quickly as it had opened, swallowed up by the ordinary business of getting a soaked governess and a nearly drowned dog back into the warmth of the house. But something had shifted, and Eleanor knew it, and she suspected, from the way he had looked at her crouched there on the grass, that he knew it too. That evening, wrapped once again in a borrowed robe in front of the fire in her room, she found she could not stop thinking about the sound of her own name in his voice, stripped of every careful formality he usually wore like armor. She was still turning it over in her mind when a knock came at her door, soft and hesitant, entirely unlike the confident stride she associated with him. "Forgive the hour," he said, when she opened the door to find him standing in the corridor, still in his day clothes, though it was well past when the household usually retired. "I only wished to see for myself that you had taken no lasting harm." "I am quite recovered," she said, "truly. It was a cold swim and nothing worse." He did not leave. He stood there in the doorway, and she saw in his face something she recognized now from the day of the goat and the linens, that same fight happening behind his eyes, some old habit of restraint wrestling against something newer and less easily controlled. "You frightened me today," he said finally. "I have not been frightened like that in a very long time. I did not care for it." "I am sorry," she said, though she was not entirely sure what she was apologizing for. "Do not be," he said. "It was not a complaint. It was only an observation about myself that I had not expected to make." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and he seemed to gather himself, seemed to decide something, and stepped back from the doorway as though physically pulling himself away from a pull he did not entirely trust. "Good night, Miss Hartley," he said, and this time the formal address felt deliberate, felt like a wall he was rebuilding brick by brick even as he said it, and she understood, watching him go, that whatever had cracked open in him that afternoon at the pond had frightened him as much as her scream had frightened her. It was 3 days later, at a dinner arranged in the village to celebrate the harvest, that the wall came down entirely, and in front of witnesses this time. The evening had gone pleasantly enough. The local families gathered in the assembly rooms above the inn, tables laden with food, a small group of musicians tuning their instruments in the corner. Eleanor had come along at Sophie's insistence, and had spent much of the evening keeping the girl entertained while the Duke made the rounds of polite conversation expected of a man in his position, his manner correct and contained as always. It was Sophie who caused the trouble, in the end, though trouble was too strong a word for what actually happened. She had been given permission to try a small taste of the spiced cider being served to the adults, watered down considerably at Eleanor's insistence, and had declared, with the great seriousness of a 12-year-old delivering important news, that she intended to become a farmer instead of a duchess. Because farmers got to keep goats, and goats, she had decided after their memorable encounter weeks before, were clearly the superior form of livestock, being both entertaining and, in her considered opinion, superior company to most of the gentlemen currently in the room. The comment, delivered at full volume during a brief lull in the surrounding conversation, drew a ripple of laughter from the nearby tables, and Eleanor, catching Sophie's proud and entirely unrepentant expression, could not help laughing herself, and reached over to smooth the girl's hair, with an affection that had become entirely natural over the past weeks. The Duke, standing nearby with a glass in his hand, listening to his sister's solemn declaration about the moral superiority of goats over gentlemen, lost the battle he had been fighting for years in a single unguarded instant. He laughed. Not the small rusty sound from the lawn weeks before, quickly swallowed and denied. This was full and unrestrained, a real laugh, warm and surprised out of him, the kind that changed his entire face, that made him look, for one extraordinary moment, like a man Eleanor suspected he had once been, years ago, before grief had taught him to keep every door in himself locked and bolted. The room went quiet around them, not from disapproval, but from simple astonishment, because half the people in that assembly room had known the Duke of Ashbourne for years, and not one of them had ever heard that sound come out of him, and they stared, and he seemed to realize it a moment too late to stop himself, seemed to feel the weight of every eye in the room turning toward him, and Eleanor watched something like panic flicker across his face before he mastered it. But it was too late. Sophie was staring up at her brother with an expression of pure delight, and an elderly woman at the next table had actually put a hand to her chest, and Eleanor heard, quite clearly, someone at a nearby table murmur to their companion that they had not heard the Duke of Ashbourne laugh since before the old Duke's funeral, and did she think it meant something had finally changed. The Duke set down his glass and, with visible effort, reassembled his composure, but Eleanor, watching him across the small distance between them, saw that his eyes had found hers before he had managed to hide anything at all, and in that unguarded look she saw not embarrassment, not regret, but something closer to wonder, as though he had just discovered something about himself he had believed permanently lost, and did not yet know what to do with having found it again. He did not speak to her directly for the rest of the evening, kept carefully at a polite distance as propriety required in so public a setting, but she felt his attention on her more than once across the room, and on the ride home, with Sophie asleep against her shoulder in the carriage, she found him watching her in the near darkness with an expression she could not read and did not try to name, because naming it felt, somehow, like it would make it too real to safely hold. By the next morning the story had traveled through the household with the speed such stories always seem to manage, servants passing it between them in the corridors, Mrs. Pruitt bringing it to Eleanor along with her morning tea, her round face bright with an excitement she did not bother to hide. "The whole village is talking of nothing else," she said, setting down the tray. "His Grace, laughing out loud at the harvest supper, in front of half the county. I have worked in this house 11 years, Miss Hartley, and I never thought I would live to hear it again." Eleanor stirred her tea and said nothing, though she felt the housekeeper's eyes on her, curious and knowing in a way that made her cheeks warm slightly. "It is a fine thing," Mrs. Pruitt went on, "when a house starts to breathe again after being held so tight for so long. Whatever the cause of it," she said this last part with a small, meaningful smile, and left the room before Eleanor could decide how to respond to it. Lady Camilla, when Eleanor encountered her later that morning in the corridor outside the drawing room, did not share the housekeeper's warmth on the subject. She had heard, of course, everyone had heard, and her expression when she looked at Eleanor now carried none of the careless dismissal from their first meeting. It had sharpened into something more watchful, more calculating, the look of a woman recalculating the odds of a contest she had assumed. Until recently, she had already won. "I understand my dear Julian was quite amused last evening," she said, her tone light but her eyes anything but. "Something about a farmer and some livestock, I am told. How droll." "Sophie has strong opinions about goats," Eleanor said mildly. "I take no credit for her comedic timing." Lady Camilla's smile did not waver, but something behind it had gone cold. "No," she said, "I imagine you would not. And yet I find it curious, Miss Hartley, how much livelier this house has become since your arrival. One might almost think you had set out to accomplish it on purpose." "I assure you," Eleanor said, keeping her voice even, "I set out only to teach Sophie her lessons. Anything beyond that has been entirely beside the point." "Of course," Lady Camilla said, in a tone that made it clear she believed nothing of the sort, and swept past her toward the stairs, leaving behind a silence that felt considerably less comfortable than the one Eleanor had grown used to sharing with the Duke. She found him later that day in the study, going over estate accounts with the steady, methodical attention he brought to most things, and when he looked up and saw her in the doorway, something in his expression eased, as though her presence alone loosened some tension he had been carrying all morning. "The whole county seems to have opinions about your laughter," she said, by way of greeting. He set down his pen. "So I am told. I have received no fewer than 3 notes this morning from neighbors expressing their delight at my apparent recovery from whatever ailment they believed had silenced me these past years." "Does it trouble you?" she asked, being watched so closely for it. He considered the question seriously, turning it over before answering, which she had come to recognize as one of his particular habits, this refusal to offer an easy answer where an honest one required more thought. "It did," he said, "this morning. It felt like being observed through a window I had not agreed to leave open. But it troubles me rather less now than it did at breakfast." "Why is that?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. He looked at her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded moving behind his eyes before he caught it, the way he always seemed to catch these moments just before they went too far, pulling them back into careful, safer territory. "Because I find," he said, "that I do not entirely regret it, which is, I will admit, a stranger feeling than the laugh itself." Eleanor held his gaze a moment longer than was strictly proper, longer than a governess ought to hold a duke's gaze in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, and then made herself look away, made herself remember Lady Camilla's cold eyes in the corridor, and the fortnight still stretching ahead of them, and the enormous, immovable distance that still stood between a duke and the woman hired to teach his sister her letters. The Dowager Duchess arrived without warning, 3 days after Lady Camilla's fortnight should have ended, and Eleanor knew from the sound of raised voices carrying down the east corridor that something had shifted badly in the house. She had not intended to listen. She had come up the back stairs to fetch a book for Sophie's lesson, and found herself close enough to the drawing-room door to hear every word, and once she had heard the first few sentences, she found she could not make herself walk away. "You cannot possibly mean to continue this," the Dowager Duchess was saying, her voice sharp with a fury Eleanor had not expected from the composed, elegant woman she had glimpsed once or twice from a distance. "A governess, Julian. The whole county is speaking of nothing else. Lady Camilla's mother has already written to say they consider themselves insulted by your behavior at the harvest supper, laughing and carrying on in front of a hired woman as though she were a guest of standing." "I have done nothing that requires an apology," the Duke's voice answered, low and controlled, though Eleanor could hear the strain beneath it. "I laughed at something my sister said. That is the whole of my crime, mother. It is not the laughing that concerns me," the Dowager said, and here her voice dropped, forcing Eleanor to lean closer to catch the words. "It is who you were looking at when you did it. I have eyes, Julian, even if you believe the rest of the county has none. You cannot marry a governess. You are the Duke of Ashbourne. You have a name 5 centuries old and an estate that depends on the right alliance to secure its future, and Sophie's future besides. Whatever this is, whatever comfort you have found in Miss Hartley's company, it must end, and it must end now, before it becomes something neither of you can walk back from." There was a long silence, long enough that Eleanor's heart had time to climb into her throat and lodge there, painful and immovable. "She is nothing more than my sister's governess," the Duke said finally, and something in the flatness of his voice, the careful, rehearsed quality of it, hurt Eleanor more than she expected, even knowing it was likely the only answer that could end the conversation without disaster. "Then prove it," the Dowager said. "Marry Lady Camilla before the year is out. It is a good match, a sensible match, and it will silence every tongue in the county before this nonsense grows into something that cannot be undone." Eleanor did not wait to hear his answer. She turned and walked quickly back the way she had come, her hands pressed together to keep them from shaking, and did not stop walking until she reached the schoolroom, where Sophie looked up from her drawing and asked why Eleanor looked as though she had seen a ghost. "It is nothing," Eleanor said, forcing a smile that felt like glass on her face. "Only a bit of a chill in the corridor." She did not see the Duke again until dinner, and when she did, she found she could not meet his eyes across the table, could not look at him without hearing his mother's voice again, without hearing the flat, careful denial he had offered in response, true as it might have been in the strictest sense, and cruel in every other. Sophie chattered through the meal, oblivious to the tension stretched taut between the two adults at either end of the table, and Eleanor answered her questions and ate very little, and excused herself as soon as she reasonably could. "Miss Hartley," the Duke said, catching her at the door before she could escape entirely. "A word, if you would permit it." "I am rather tired tonight, Your Grace," she said, using the formal address deliberately now, a wall of her own construction. "I think I will retire early." "Eleanor," he said, and the use of her given name, after the corridor she had overheard, felt like something she did not have the strength to bear just then. "Please," she said, and something in her voice must have carried more than she intended, because he stopped, and did not follow her, and she made it to her room and closed the door before the tears she had been holding back finally came. She did not sleep well that night, and by morning she had made a decision, turning it over so many times in the dark hours that it had worn smooth and certain by the time the sun rose. She would give notice. She would find another post, in another county, far enough from Ashbourne Hall that no one would think to connect her name with the strange rumor of a duke who had laughed once at a harvest supper and never quite explained why. It was the only fair thing to do, she told herself. Whatever had grown between them these past weeks, whatever she had allowed herself to feel in the quiet hours by the library fire, it could only end in scandal for him, and heartbreak for herself. And she had spent enough of her life without security to know better than to trade what stability she had for something that could never, by the rules of the world she lived in, be permitted to last. She found the Duke in his study before breakfast, before her courage could fail her, and told him plainly, without preamble, that she intended to give a month's notice and seek another position. He went very still. "May I ask why?" he said, though something in his face suggested he already suspected the answer. "I overheard your conversation with your mother yesterday," she said. "I did not mean to. I was passing the drawing room and could not help but hear. I understand the position I have put you in, however unintentionally, and I think it is best for everyone, for Sophie especially, if I remove myself from the situation before it causes you any further difficulty." "Eleanor," he said, and this time she did not stop him from using her name, because something in his voice had changed entirely from the careful, denying tone he had used with his mother, gone rough and urgent in a way that made her chest ache. "What you heard was not the truth. It was the only answer that would end that particular conversation without my mother summoning half the family to intervene in my personal affairs. I have no intention of marrying Lady Camilla. I have had no intention of it since the day my mother first suggested her name, and considerably less intention of it since you arrived in a ditch outside my gate and turned this entire house inside out." "Then what do you intend?" she asked, her voice barely steady. He crossed the room to stand before her, closer than propriety strictly allowed, close enough that she had to tip her head back slightly to hold his gaze. "I intend," he said, "to stop pretending that the last 2 months have not changed something in me that I believed was gone for good. I intend to stop letting my mother, or the county, or 5 centuries of family expectation decide who I am permitted to care for. But I cannot ask you to stay on the strength of intentions alone, not when staying means facing exactly the kind of talk and difficulty you are trying to spare me. That decision has to be yours, made with clear eyes, not mine, made for you." Eleanor stood there, caught between the safety of the decision she had made in the dark hours of the night, and the pull of everything he was offering her now, unguarded, and plainly stated in a way she had not expected from a man who had spent 5 years locking every door in himself, against exactly this kind of risk. "I do not know if I have the courage for what you are describing," she said honestly. "I have spent my whole life being the person who leaves quietly before she can be asked to leave, or worse, before she can be made to stay somewhere she is not wanted. I do not know how to do the other thing. I do not know how to stay and fight for something the whole world will tell me I have no right to want. Then perhaps, he said quietly, we learn it together. I have spent 5 years being the man who closes every door before anyone else has the chance to close it on him first. Neither of us, I think, has had much practice at the alternative. She almost said yes then, standing in the pale morning light of his study, close enough to feel the warmth coming off him, close enough to see the hope he was not quite bothering to hide anymore. But the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor outside broke the moment before she could answer, and a moment later the door opened without a knock, and Mrs. Pruitt stood there, pale and out of breath, with news that drove every other thought from both their minds entirely. "It is Sophie," she said. "She has gone missing from the schoolroom, and no one in the house has seen her for the better part of an hour." Every other thought vanished from Eleanor's mind at once. She was already moving before the Duke had finished crossing the room, her mind racing through the possibilities, the pond first among them, cold fear closing around her chest at the memory of the terrier thrashing in the water weeks before. "The pond," she said. "We must check the pond first." He was ahead of her before she finished speaking, calling for the footman as he went, and within minutes the entire household had spread out across the grounds, servants calling Sophie's name into the stables, the orchard, the walled garden, every place a 12-year-old girl might think to hide or wander. Eleanor ran for the pond herself, her heart hammering, and found it undisturbed, the surface calm and empty in the morning light, and she did not know whether to feel relieved or more frightened still, now that the most obvious danger had been ruled out and a dozen less certain ones remained. She found the Duke a few minutes later, near the stable yard, his face carved from the same cold stone she remembered from their very first meeting, though now she understood it for what it truly was, not indifference but a man holding terror behind a controlled expression because falling apart would not help anyone find his sister any faster. "Thunder is missing from his stall," one of the grooms reported, breathless, having run the length of the yard to deliver the news, "and her boots are gone from the schoolroom. I do not think she has wandered off on foot, Your Grace. I believe she has taken the horse." The Duke's expression tightened further. "She has never ridden alone in her life," he said. "She knows better than to attempt it. She has been talking of nothing but thunder for weeks," Eleanor said, her mind working quickly now, trying to think as Sophie might think. "And yesterday, at breakfast, you told her she was too young yet to ride beyond the near paddock without supervision." She was disappointed. I remember her face when you said it. Understanding passed between them in a single glance, and without another word they were both moving toward the stables, calling for 2 more horses to be saddled, while the Duke gave rapid instructions to the remaining staff to continue searching the grounds nearer the house, in case they were wrong. They rode out along the bridle path that led toward the eastern boundary of the estate, the direction Sophie had always favored on her supervised rides, the Duke setting a pace that pushed the horses hard, Eleanor keeping close behind him despite her limited experience in the saddle, driven by a fear that made every other consideration feel small by comparison. They found her nearly 2 miles out, at the edge of a stretch of woodland the estate maps called Thornfield Copse, where the path narrowed and grew treacherous with exposed roots and loose stone. Thunder stood riderless a short distance from the path, grazing calmly as though nothing at all were amiss, and it took Eleanor's heart nearly stopping before she spotted Sophie herself, sitting on the ground a little further on, one leg drawn up awkwardly beneath her, her face streaked with tears and dirt, very much alive and very much frightened. "Sophie," the Duke called, already off his horse before it had fully stopped, crossing the distance between them at a run. "I am sorry," Sophie said immediately, her voice small and thick with tears. "I only wanted to prove I could ride him properly, and then he startled at something in the trees, and I fell, and I could not stand up again. And I did not know what to do, and I have been so frightened, Julian. I have been so frightened." The Duke knelt beside her, his hands moving carefully over her leg, his face a study in barely controlled worry as he assessed the damage. "It is not broken," he said finally, relief audible in every word. "Twisted badly, I think, and you will not be walking easily for some days, but it is not broken. Thank God for that mercy at least." Eleanor knelt on Sophie's other side, smoothing the girl's hair back from her tear-streaked face, her own relief so overwhelming it nearly brought her to tears as well. "You frightened us terribly," she said gently, though there was no anger in it, only the aftermath of fear finally allowed to ease. "I know," Sophie said miserably. "I only wanted him to see that I was not too young. I wanted him to be proud of me the way he looked proud of you, that day at the harvest supper, when you were not even trying to make him laugh at all." Something passed between Eleanor and the Duke over the top of Sophie's bent head, a look neither of them could fully hide from the other. and Eleanor felt her throat tighten with an emotion too large and too complicated to name in that moment. "I am always proud of you," the Duke said quietly, gathering his sister carefully into his arms to carry her back to where the horses waited. "You do not need to prove anything to me by risking your neck on a bridle path, Sophie. You only need to stay whole and safe and here, with me. That is all I have ever asked of anyone I care for, and it is more than enough." The ride back to the house was slow and careful, the Duke keeping Sophie settled before him on his own horse while Eleanor led Thunder behind them. And by the time they reached Ashbourne Hall, the entire staff had gathered in the courtyard, relief breaking across every face as Sophie was carried inside to be examined properly by the physician sent for from the village. It was hours later, once Sophie had been settled into bed with her leg bound and a cup of warm milk pressed into her hands, once the household had finally begun to breathe normally again, that Eleanor found herself alone with the Duke once more, standing together outside Sophie's door in the quiet of the evening, the conversation from that morning still hanging unfinished between them. "I have not forgotten what we were discussing before Mrs. Pruitt interrupted us," he said quietly. "Neither have I," Eleanor admitted. "Today reminded me of something," he said, his eyes searching her face in the low candlelight of the corridor. "It reminded me how quickly everything a person cares about can be taken from them, without warning, without permission, and how foolish it would be to spend whatever time is given to us pretending we do not care simply because caring makes us vulnerable to that loss. I lost Isabel because the world can be cruel and sudden, not because I loved her too openly. I have spent 5 years believing the opposite, and I think today proved to me how wrong I have been." Eleanor felt her carefully constructed resolve, the decision she had made in the dark hours of the previous night, begin to crumble under the weight of everything he was saying, everything he was not quite saying as well. "What are you asking me?" she said softly. "I am asking you to stay," he said, "not as my sister's governess, though I hope you will remain close to her regardless of what else changes between us. I am asking you to stay and let me find out, properly, without my mother's voice or the county's opinion standing between us, whether what has grown here these past 2 months is something worth risking everything for. I cannot promise you it will be easy. I can only promise you that I have not wanted anything this much in 5 years, and I do not intend to let it go quietly simply because it frightens me." The Dowager Duchess returned to Ashbourne Hall 4 days later, and this time she did not come alone. Eleanor heard the carriages arrive from the schoolroom window, 3 of them in a line, and recognized the crest on the second before Mrs. Pruitt arrived, flustered and out of breath, to explain that the Dowager had brought Lady Camilla and her mother along with her, along with, of all people, a cousin of the Duke's named Lord Edmund Fairfax, a thin, sharp-faced man who had once, Mrs. Pruitt whispered, made no secret of his hope that the Duke would die without an heir and leave the title to fall, eventually, into his own branch of the family. "They mean to settle it today," Mrs. Pruitt said grimly. "Whatever it is they intend to settle. The whole staff can feel it in the air, Miss Hartley, like a storm building before it breaks." Eleanor's hands had gone cold, but she made herself finish the lesson she had been giving Sophie, made herself keep her voice steady and even, though her mind was already racing ahead to the confrontation she suspected was gathering downstairs like weather. She did not have to wait long. Within the hour, a footman arrived at the schoolroom door with a request, delivered in a tone that made it clear it was not truly a request at all, that Miss Hartley present herself in the drawing room. The room, when she entered it, felt smaller than she remembered, crowded with people whose eyes turned toward her all at once, weighing and judging in a way that made her acutely aware of her plain gray dress among all that silk and fine tailoring. The Dowager Duchess sat in the largest chair near the fire, her posture rigid with disapproval. Lady Camilla stood near the window, her expression carefully composed but her eyes sharp with something that might have been triumph. Her mother sat beside the Dowager, murmuring occasionally behind a gloved hand. Lord Edmund lounged near the mantel with the studied carelessness of a man who believed himself already victorious in whatever contest was about to unfold. The Duke stood apart from all of them, near the far wall, and when his eyes found Eleanor's across the room, something in his shoulders eased slightly, though the tension in the rest of him remained. "Miss Hartley," the Dowager said, without preamble, once the door had closed behind her. "I understand from my son that you and he have had certain conversations of a personal nature. I have come to put an end to whatever misunderstanding has arisen between you, before it does further damage to this family's standing." "There is no misunderstanding, Mother," the Duke said, his voice steady but carrying an edge Eleanor had not heard from him before. The Dowager did not so much as glance at him. "Miss Hartley," she continued, as though he had not spoken at all, "you are, I am sure, an intelligent woman, And you must understand the position you would place my son in, should this foolishness continue. He has a name to uphold. He has an estate that depends on the right alliance for its future security. Tenant families whose livelihoods rest on decisions made by men who marry wisely rather than sentimentally. Lady Camilla's family has offered a match that would secure all of that. What, precisely, do you believe you can offer in its place? The question hung in the room, cruel in its simplicity, and Eleanor felt every eye turned to her, waiting, some with genuine curiosity, others, Lord Edmund especially, with poorly concealed amusement at the spectacle of watching a governess be publicly dismantled. For a moment, the old fear rose in her, the same fear that had sent her fleeing to her room after overhearing this same conversation 4 days before. The fear of being unwanted, unwelcome, a temporary fixture in other people's lives who could be removed the moment she became inconvenient. But she thought of Sophie's face at the edge of the bridle path, of the Duke's laugh breaking free across the harvest supper, of 2 months spent learning that honesty, plainly spoken, had never once failed her, whatever else it had cost. I do not believe I can offer an estate, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. I cannot offer a title or land or the kind of alliance that secures tenant families through the strength of a family name alone. I have never claimed to be able to offer any of those things, and I would not insult this family by pretending otherwise. The dowager's expression flickered with something like satisfaction, as though the matter had already been settled in her favor. But I can offer him this, Eleanor continued, before the silence could close over her words. I can offer a house where his sister laughs without fear of being told she is too loud, too young, too much trouble to be borne. I can offer honesty spoken plainly, without calculation, from someone who wants nothing from him beyond the simple fact of his company. I watched this house for 2 months, Your Grace, before I understood what had gone quiet in it, and I have watched it, these past weeks, slowly learn to breathe again. I do not know what an alliance is worth, measured against that. I only know what I have seen with my own eyes, living under this roof, and I will not stand here and pretend I believe it worth less. Lady Camilla's composed expression had begun to crack at the edges, something brittle and angry showing through. This is absurd, she said, her voice rising slightly. You would have him throw away everything, his family's standing, 5 centuries of careful alliance, for a governess with no fortune and no name worth mentioning? I would have him choose for himself, Eleanor said, turning to face her directly. Which is a choice, I think, that has been made for him by other people for a very long time, and has not, by his own account, brought him any particular happiness in the making of it. The Duke crossed the room then, closing the distance between himself and Eleanor in a way that made the intent of it unmistakable to everyone watching, and took her hand in his without a trace of the caution he had shown 4 days earlier outside his study. I have listened to this family discuss my future as though I were a piece of land to be settled rather than a man permitted an opinion of his own, he said, addressing the room at large now, his voice carrying the same steady clarity Eleanor had heard from him only in their most private moments. I buried Isabel 5 years ago, and I buried myself alongside her, and I let all of you decide, in the years since, what shape my grief was permitted to take, and how long it was permitted to last. I am finished allowing that. Miss Hartley has given my sister back her laughter and given me back something I had believed gone for good, and I will not throw that away to satisfy an alliance built on nothing more than land and old habit. Julian, the dowager began, her voice sharper now, edged with something close to panic. I love you, Mother, he said, more gently than before, but I am no longer willing to let your fear of scandal decide my life for me. Sophie deserves to grow up in a house that laughs. I deserve, I think, after 5 years of silence, to choose warmth over caution, at least once, before I am too old and too careful to remember how. Lord Edmund, sensing perhaps that whatever hope he had harbored for the title falling into his branch of the family had just evaporated entirely, made a hasty excuse about needing to see to his horses, and left the room without further comment. Lady Camilla's mother rose stiffly and, after a whispered exchange with her daughter, announced that they would be departing that very afternoon, their visit having reached, in her carefully chosen words, its natural conclusion. Lady Camilla herself paused at the door, looking back at Eleanor with an expression that had finally shed all its careful composure, leaving only something raw and disappointed behind. I hope, she said quietly, that you understand exactly what you are taking on. This family does not forgive easily, whatever he says today in the heat of the moment. I understand it well enough, Eleanor said, meeting her gaze steadily. I have spent my whole life taking on things other people believed too difficult to be worth the risk. I do not intend to stop now. Lady Camilla left without another word, and the door closed behind her, and the room, so crowded and tense only minutes before, emptied slowly until only the dowager remained, sitting very still in her chair by the fire, staring at her son, and the governess whose hand he still held without any apparent intention of releasing it. "You understand," the dowager said finally, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier sharpness, "that there will be talk, a great deal of it, and not all of it kind. There has been talk about me for 5 years already, Mother," the Duke said. "I find I would rather have it said that I chose happiness over caution than continue to have it whispered that grief hollowed me out entirely and left nothing behind worth mentioning." The dowager was silent for a long moment, studying Eleanor with an expression that had shifted from hostility into something more thoughtful, more searching. Finally, she rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts with the automatic grace of a woman who had spent her entire life performing composure regardless of what she felt beneath it. "I loved your father very much," she said to her son, unexpectedly, her voice softer than Eleanor had yet heard it. "I have perhaps forgotten, in my fear of losing you the way I lost Isabel's promise for this family, what it looked like when you were happy simply for its own sake, without calculation attached to it. I will not pretend I am not still afraid for you. But I find, watching you just now, that I have missed the sound of you speaking with such conviction about anything at all." She turned to Eleanor, her expression not warm, not yet, but no longer entirely cold either. "I make no promises about how quickly the county will come around, Miss Hartley. But I will not stand in your way, provided you continue to make my son look as he does right now, when he speaks of you." She left the room without waiting for a response, and Eleanor found herself alone with the Duke at last, the fire crackling softly in the empty drawing room, the last of the afternoon light slanting gold across the floor. "That went rather better than I expected," he said, and there was something light in his voice now, something unburdened, that she had not heard from him even at the harvest supper. "I nearly said nothing at all," she admitted. "I was terrified." "You did not sound terrified," he said. "You sounded like someone who has spent her whole life fighting for things worth keeping, and had simply decided this was one more thing worth the fight." He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to it, gentle and unhurried, and when he looked up at her again, his eyes held none of the careful reserve she had first encountered in the storm 2 months before, none of the grief that had shadowed every conversation they had shared since. There was only warmth there now, open and unguarded, the same warmth that had broken loose across the assembly rooms weeks earlier and had, it seemed, decided finally to stay. "Stay with me," he said again, this time without the shadow of doubt that had colored the question 4 days before. "Not because a fortune or an alliance requires it, but because I have not laughed, truly laughed, in 5 years, until you walked dripping into my front hall and told me the storm had not consulted either of us before breaking your wheel. I would like very much to keep laughing, Eleanor, for the rest of my life, if you are willing to be the reason for it." Eleanor felt her own smile break free, wide and unguarded, matching his entirely, and reached up to touch his face, still faintly disbelieving that the cold, closed man from that first storm-swept night stood before her now so entirely transformed. "I think," she said, "I have been willing since the goat ran through the linens, though I did not have the sense to admit it to myself until now." He laughed then, the same rough, rusty, wonderful sound she had first heard on the lawn weeks before, no longer surprised by it, no longer trying to swallow it back down, and outside the drawing-room windows, across the whole quiet estate of Ashbourne Hall, the last of the autumn light settled gold and warm, over grounds that had, after 5 long years of silence, finally learned to hold laughter again, and meant, this time, to keep it. News of the betrothal spread through the county within days, carried on the same current of gossip that had once whispered of a duke too broken by grief to be reached, and this time the whispers carried a different note entirely, curiosity mixed with something that sounded, more often than not, like genuine gladness. Not everyone approved. Eleanor heard, second-hand, of dinner tables where her name was mentioned with a raised eyebrow, of letters exchanged between families who found the match beneath what they believed a duke owed his position. But she found, to her surprise, that she minded it far less than she had expected to, buoyed as she was by the steadiness of the man beside her, and the fierce, open delight of the girl who had begun, within the week, calling her something softer and warmer than Miss Hartley, whenever she thought no one else was listening closely enough to correct her. Sophie's leg healed within a month, and by the time the first frost arrived, she was riding thunder again, carefully and under close supervision, though the Duke found he could not quite bring himself to scold her for wanting the freedom of it, Not after everything that near loss had taught him about the cost of holding love too cautiously. The wedding itself was small, held in the chapel at Ashbourne Hall rather than the grand society affair the county might have expected of a duke, a decision the duke had insisted upon and Eleanor had gratefully accepted. Mrs. Pruitt wept openly through the ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she had clearly brought for exactly that purpose, and the Dowager Duchess, seated in the front pew, watched her son with an expression that had, in the months since that difficult afternoon in the drawing room, softened considerably into something Eleanor had come to recognize, cautiously, as approval. Sophie stood as the sole attendant, her leg fully healed, her face bright with an unrestrained joy that Eleanor suspected had been entirely absent from this house for the 5 long years before her own arrival. And when the ceremony ended and the small gathered crowd began to applaud, it was Sophie's laughter that rang clearest above the rest, high and delighted, a sound that had once been rare in this house and now, it seemed, had become as ordinary and expected as the turning of the seasons. That evening, once the small wedding party had dispersed and the house had settled into its familiar quiet, Eleanor found her husband standing at the same paddock fence where they had once stood together in careful, uncertain silence, watching the horses move slowly through the blue dusk. "You are thinking of Isabel," she said softly, coming to stand beside him, not from jealousy, but because she had learned, these past months, to recognize the particular stillness that settled over him whenever his mind drifted back toward the grief that had shaped so much of who he had become. He did not deny it. "I am," he said. "I think I will always think of her, in small moments like this one, but it does not hurt the way it once did. I find I can hold her memory now without it closing every other door in me shut. I did not think that would ever be possible again." "Grief does not ask permission to visit," Eleanor said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "It only asks, I think, that we not let it live alone in every room of the house forever." He turned to look at her then, and in the fading light she saw none of the cold, guarded stranger who had once looked at her across his entrance hall as though she were an intrusion the storm had inflicted upon him. There was only warmth in his face now, easy and unhidden, the particular warmth of a man who had learned, slowly and against every instinct grief had taught him, how to let someone matter to him again, without immediately bracing for the loss of them. "No," he agreed, wrapping his arm around her and drawing her close against the evening chill. "It does not have to live alone. Not anymore." Somewhere behind them, in the golden windows of Ashbourne Hall, Sophie's laughter rang out again, bright and unrestrained, carrying across the darkening lawn like proof that a house could indeed learn to breathe again, given time, and patience, and the right kind of quiet courage to let warmth back in, through a door that had been closed for far too long. A year had passed since the wedding when the letter arrived that nearly undid everything Eleanor had built at Ashbourne Hall, and it came, of all places, from a solicitor in London she had never heard of before that morning. She read it twice at the breakfast table, her tea going cold in front of her, before she trusted herself to speak. Julian, watching her from across the table, set down his own cup and asked, quietly, what had drained the color from her face so completely. "It is about my father's estate," she said slowly. "There was a dispute, years ago, before he died, over a small property left to him by a distant relation. I had believed it lost entirely, sold to cover debts after his death. This letter says the sale was never properly completed, and that the property, and a modest income attached to it, rightfully belongs to me. That should be welcome news," he said carefully, watching her face for the reason it plainly was not. "It should," she agreed. "Except that the solicitor writes that a cousin of my father's, a man named Gerald Whitcomb, has occupied the property for the past 6 years, and has already begun making arrangements to contest my claim in court, arguing that I abandoned any right to it when I left to earn my own living, rather than pursuing the matter sooner. He is, by all accounts, a man with considerable influence in the courts of that county, and I have neither the money nor the standing to fight him alone." Julian's expression hardened in a way Eleanor recognized now, the particular stillness that came over him when something threatened someone he had decided to protect. "You are no longer alone in anything," he said. "Whatever this Gerald Whitcomb believes about contesting a claim, he has not yet reckoned with contesting it against the Duke of Ashbourne's wife." It took the better part of 2 months to resolve, months during which Eleanor traveled twice to the county in question, accompanied always by Julian, and, more often than either of them expected to need, by Sophie as well, who had declared herself entirely unwilling to be left behind for so important a matter, particularly one that involved, in her words, defending her sister against a man who sounded thoroughly disagreeable. The court proceedings themselves were tense and at times, deeply unpleasant. Gerald Whitcomb proved to be exactly the sort of man Eleanor had expected from the solicitor's letter, smooth-spoken and confident, accustomed to getting his way through influence rather than merit, and he did not take kindly to being opposed by a woman he clearly believed should have simply accepted her losses years before and been grateful for whatever scraps remained. "You abandoned this property the moment you chose to earn your bread as a servant rather than fight for what was owed you," he said to her directly, during one particularly heated session, his tone dripping with the kind of condescension Eleanor had grown all too familiar with during her years moving between other people's households. A woman who could not be bothered to pursue her own inheritance hardly deserves the court's sympathy now, simply because she has since married well enough to afford better lawyers than she once could. Eleanor felt the old sting of it, the implication that her years of quiet, difficult work had been some kind of failure rather than survival, but she found, standing there in that unfamiliar courtroom with Julian's steady presence beside her, and Sophie's fierce, unwavering faith in her just behind, that the sting no longer had the power to silence her the way it once might have. "I did not abandon anything," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "I was 17 years old when my father died, with no money, no protector, and no understanding of the law sufficient to contest a sale I was told, at the time, had already been completed. I spent the years since working honestly for every meal and every roof over my head, asking nothing of anyone that I had not earned through my own labor. That is not abandonment, sir. That is survival. And I will not apologize for having managed it without the benefit of a solicitor's letter I did not know existed until 3 months ago." The judge, an elderly man who had listened to the proceedings with a careful, unreadable expression throughout, ruled in her favor within the week, finding that the original sale had indeed been improperly executed and that Gerald Whitcomb's occupation of the property, however long-standing, conferred no legal right upon him whatsoever. Eleanor left the courtroom with the property restored to her name, along with a modest income that, while nothing compared to the wealth of Ashbourne, felt to her like something far more valuable, proof that the years she had spent surviving on her own had not, in the end, cost her everything she might otherwise have claimed. That night, in the small inn where they had taken rooms for the duration of the proceedings, Sophie fell asleep early, exhausted by the excitement of the day, and Eleanor sat with Julian by a modest fire that could not compare to the grand hearths of Ashbourne Hall but felt, in that moment, entirely sufficient for everything she needed. "You did not need me in that courtroom," he said, watching her with an expression of quiet pride. "You would have won that argument whether I sat beside you or not." "Perhaps," she said, "but I am glad you were there regardless. There is a difference between surviving alone, which I have done for most of my life, and choosing, when I no longer have to let someone stand beside me anyway." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers, and for a while neither of them spoke, content simply to sit together in the quiet, listening to the fire and the distant sounds of the inn settling for the night. "What will you do with the property?" he asked eventually, "now that it is rightfully yours again?" She had thought about this already, turning the question over during the long carriage rides between Ashbourne and the county courthouse. "I think," she said slowly, "I should like to see it made into something useful. A school, perhaps, for children whose families cannot afford a governess of their own, or a home for young women in the position I once found myself in, with nowhere else to turn when the world has taken everything from them too soon. I do not need the income for myself. I have more than I ever expected to have, in every way that matters. But I have not forgotten what it felt like to have nothing, and nowhere certain to land." Julian's expression, when she looked up at him, held something that made her breath catch, a depth of admiration she had not expected even after a year of marriage, as though he were seeing some new facet of her come into focus that he had not fully appreciated before. "Then that is what we shall do with it," he said, "together, if you will allow me the privilege of helping." "I would like nothing better," she said, and meant it entirely. They returned to Ashbourne Hall a week later, the matter settled, the property secured, and within the year the old house on the disputed land had been transformed, under Eleanor's careful direction and with Julian's considerable resources behind her, into a modest school for girls without family or fortune to secure their futures, staffed by teachers Eleanor herself had helped select, each one chosen for the same quality she had once needed most in her own difficult years, a willingness to see worth in a girl the rest of the world had already decided to overlook. Sophie, now 13 and fiercely proud of her role as the school's most frequent visitor, took to bringing books and small gifts on her visits, and declared, more than once, that she intended to teach there herself one day, once she was old enough to be taken seriously by pupils who might otherwise mistake her for a fellow student rather than an instructor. You have your aunt's stubbornness, Julian told her once, watching her organize a shelf of donated books with the same fierce determination she had once brought to naming a rescued horse. I have Eleanor's stubbornness, Sophie corrected primly, without looking up from her task, which I am told is a far more useful quality to inherit than most of what comes attached to this family's name. Julian laughed at that, easily and without restraint, the sound as natural to him now as breathing, and Eleanor, watching the two of them from across the room, thought of the cold, silent house she had first entered on a stormy night 2 years before, and marveled at how thoroughly it had transformed itself since, not through any grand gesture or single dramatic turn, but through the slow, patient accumulation of small moments, a shared laugh, an honest conversation, a hand offered and accepted, until warmth had settled so completely into every corner of Ashbourne Hall that it was difficult now to remember it had ever been anything else. The Dowager Duchess visited often in those years, her early reservations having softened entirely into something Eleanor had come to treasure, a genuine, unguarded fondness that showed itself in small ways, a hand pressed warmly to Eleanor's shoulder during family dinners, an unprompted letter of support sent during the courtroom troubles over the property, a quiet word of thanks offered once, privately, for having given her son back to her after 5 years of watching him disappear a little further behind his own careful walls with each passing season. I did not think I would live to see him this way again, she confided to Eleanor one evening, watching Julian across the drawing room as he listened, with visible delight, to Sophie's latest and most ambitious plan for the school's expanding library. I spent so many years afraid that grief had simply hollowed him out for good, that I had forgotten what he looked like when happiness was not something he had to work to perform for the benefit of others. He is not performing it now, Eleanor said softly. No, the Dowager agreed, her eyes still on her son. He is not, and I find I owe you a debt for that I do not know how to properly repay, Miss Hartley, whatever title you carry now. You owe me nothing, Eleanor said. He found his own way back. I only happened to be standing nearby when the door finally opened. The Dowager smiled at that, small and genuine, and said nothing more, but the warmth of the moment stayed with Eleanor long after the evening had ended. One more small proof, among so many others gathered over 2 remarkable years, that a house could indeed learn to hold both grief and joy together, provided the people living within it were brave enough to let both exist side by side, rather than locking one away in the vain hope of protecting themselves from ever feeling the other again. The Duke, who had not laughed in years, had become, by every account that mattered, a man who laughed often and easily, and the house that had once held its breath around him had learned, at last, to breathe freely again, filled with the ordinary, precious noise of a family that had chosen, deliberately and against every expectation placed upon them, to build something warm out of what grief had once left cold and silent.